What are some solved mysteries? In 1981, a Soviet submarine ran aground in Swedish waters. This was a huge deal, although the Soviets claimed the sub was in distress and didn't purposefully enter Swedish waters. Basically, everyone in Sweden saw it as evidence that their waters were being invaded by spy subs. Plus, they did some snooping of their own and determined that the sub was emitting radiation, meaning it had nukes on board. So they went along with the Soviets' clearly false claim about an accident and helped get the sub out of there. But panic was in the air. So the Swedes did exactly what you'd expect, and they prepared for more Soviet subs. I mean, when you see one Soviet sub, surely there are more, right? So Sweden developed advanced acoustic technology to detect subs, and they created a plan to basically seal off their waters when they heard a sub. And wouldn't you know it, a year later they found a Soviet sub. Well, they didn't find it, but they absolutely heard it. And they cut off the bay and figured they just had to hunt the sub down. But after a month, they couldn't find it. They gave up and reopened the bay, but they assumed the sub found a way out. But they'll get it next time. And then it happened again, but they couldn't find it again. And then again and again with no clear pattern for a decade. What the heck? Thankfully, the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union collapsed. So, no more subs, right? Yet, because the Russian subs were still coming. Wait, what? Okay, so now nothing is making sense. At this point, the Swedish military brought in outside experts to figure out what was happening. This included oceanographer types who were obvious experts in the surrounding waters. The military then played the audio evidence of the Soviet submarines, only to be told they weren't submarines at all, they were fish, and the propeller-like sound was water being released from their swim bladders. And that's the story of how the Swedish military spent 10 years and tens of millions of dollars chasing fish farts. The sailing stones of Death Valley. Rocks would magically move up to 1,500 feet in the desert. Turns out it gets cold and freezes the ground overnight, and the rocks would get pushed by the ice sheets that melted under the wind. The bloop. In 1997, a really weird and loud noise was detected underwater, and everyone was all, "What a fact was that?" In 2012, it was determined it was an iceberg breaking and or rubbing against the seabed. The case of Adrienne Shelley, screenwriter for Waitress. Husband came home to find her hanging in the shower, ruled suicide. He insists she was happy and would never kill herself, promoting another view of crime scene where they found a shoe print that matched a construction worker in the building. Sure enough, the construction worker went to rob her and thought he killed her, so staged a suicide when the hanging ended up being the actual thing that killed her. In the 1970s, a number of Japanese citizens disappeared from coastal areas in Japan. After many years, it was found out that North Korea had abducted them. In case anyone is interested, also go look up that time Kim Jong-il kidnapped a South Korean director and his actress wife, as well as the SFX team behind Godzilla, in order to make his own monster movie. I have one that most people seem to not know about. Grand Duchess Anastasia was in fact killed with the rest of her family in 1918. She never escaped, and the several women throughout the 20th century claiming to be her lied. The site of the execution of the Tsar and his family was completely untouched until 1991. Excavation found only 9 of the 11 expected remains. It wasn't until 2007 that 2 further sets of remains were found a small distance away from the previous grave's site. DNA testing found that one of the sets of remains belonged to Tsarevich Alexei and the other to one of his sisters. With this find, it proved conclusively that the entire imperial family was in fact executed and buried in 1918. It's unfortunate they weren't found sooner, but they were moved from their initial burial spot. The bodies had been mutilated, covered in acid, burned and thrown into a pit, but the location was leaked, so they brought the bodies back up and drove off towards a new site. However, there was a breakdown during travel and the bodies were quickly reburied next to the road, basically in the middle of nowhere, and covered with debris. It was such a nondescript place, it's not surprising they weren't found for so long. In the "You're Wrong About" podcast, they said that actually they were found prior to 1991 by some amateur sleuths in Russia, but because they feared what the Soviets would do with the news, they just casually reburied them and didn't mention it to anyone until the Soviet Union fell. Then they were like, "Oh look, we just found these guys." In 1991, the exact year the Soviet Union fell, Not a coincidence at all, guys. Not a lot of PPL know, but Anastasia's remains were confirmed because Prince Philip provided DNA. He was a grandnephew of the Tsarina Alexandra. While it doesn't give us who the Zodiac Killer is, just recently his most infamous 340 cipher was solved after 51 years. According to Oranchak and team, the message reads, I hope you are having lots of fun in trying to catch me. That wasn't me on the TV show, which brings up a point about me. I am not afraid of the gas chamber because it will send me to paradise all the sooner because I now have enough slaves to work for me where everyone else has nothing when they reach paradise, so they are afraid of death. I am not afraid because I know that my new life will be an easy one in paradise. Death. The Siberian craters. As the permafrost melts, the methane gas gets released and it sometimes ignites. Where is the Titanic? Most people don't realize that half of the people in the world grew up when the ship's location was still a complete mystery. Now it's old news. Where is MH370? The Erebus and the Terror were found a few years ago. The two ships were part of an Arctic expedition and disappeared 150 years ago. They had a whole section of the Museum of History in Ottawa for it a few years ago, with some of the remnants of the ship. It was very interesting. One thing that struck me was for years, the local indigenous population talked about those crazy white guys trying, and failing, to sail through the Northwest Passage, and ended up resorting to cannibalism in an attempt to survive. Their stories were ignored for decades, but what do you know, the oral histories ended up being an important part of fighting the wreckage, and they found cut marks and evidence of cannibalism on some of the bodies found on King William Island. The Solway Spaceman. In 1964, Jim Templeton, a fireman from the English city of Carlisle, was spending an afternoon out with his family when he snapped a photograph of his young daughter without much thought. But when he got home and had the film developed, he noticed what has now become known as the Solway Spaceman. The photo shows what many people say is a person in some form of space suit. Kodak even analyzed the photo and their experts said it was authentic, lending to the spaceman theory. The spaceman was his wife with her back to the camera. He was only able to see 70% of the frame and didn't realize his wife was in the background of the picture. And it took nearly how long? For his wife to realize, oh yeah, I was behind. If I remember correctly, the wife denied she was in any of the pictures in the news articles. But someone recreated it with similar clothes to what she was wearing in the other pics and it was solved. Turns out neither her nor her husband had realized she was in the background of the shot, and they had waited a while to get the pictures developed. El Dorado, or the Lost City of Gold, turned out to be a mistranslation. It was just the name of some guy that got mistranslated to the name of a city. Sounds like exactly what someone who is on the trail would say. Was he made of gold? They heard stories of a Muisca ritual where the leader would be covered in gold dust and then jump into a lake to sacrifice the gold to gods. The Spanish called him Golden Man El Dorado. Eventually they believed the name referred to a city, not a person. 1947, in British South American Airways aircraft named Stardust disappeared. Its last message was simply, Stendek, severe turbulence encountered, now descending. After an exhausting search, no trace of the aircraft was found. For years conspiracy theories and talk of alien abduction by wackos circulated. Till 1998, when mountain climbers on a remote mountain found an engine, pieces of metal, and clothing at the bottom of a glacier on the side of Mount Tupungato. Turns out the aircraft got caught flying the wrong way in the jet stream while it was flying at night, and using a system of timing when to start their descent. Being in the jet stream reduced their airspeed in relation to the Earth, and they smacked themselves straight into the side of a mountain, after which an avalanche covered the wreckage. The wreckage took decades to flow down the side of the mount with the glaciers. The glacier preserved the wreck so well that 50 years later the recovery team found identifiable remains, personal items, and could read serial numbers on the engines. Amazing, one of the landing gear tires was still inflated, and that teams continued to visit the site for periodically as more of the aircraft, cargo, and remains of passengers are still emerging from the ice. Mary Toft. Woman starts giving birth to copious amounts of rabbit parts. Woman taken to London and studied under intense supervision. Turns out she was shoving the pieces up there days before for the publicity. The Golden State Killer East Area rapist Joseph James D'Angelo, a former police officer, who was sacked for burglary and mechanic. American serial rapist, murderer, burglar. Committed at least 13 murders, 50 rapes and over 100 burglaries between 1973 to 1986. I was listening to the podcast called Case File True Crime and they hadn't yet caught the suspect. But a year or so ago they finally got him after collecting DNA evidence when he put a tissue in the bin outside. It was a confirmed match. He was only a cop for a short time before getting sacked. He was found shoplifting at store for supplies, like a hammer, dog repellent, at that time and not robbing a house. He left semen as evidence. Because he wasn't uploaded into the database or caught beforehand, there was no DNA match in the system. The way they got onto him as a suspect before gathering hard evidence of the tissue was a familiar match uploaded onto GenMatch by what was a 3-4th cousin of his. The officers in charge of case then went through 1,000 DNA profiles from his tree to finally narrow it down to him. They then swooped in to gather the tissue to get 100% clarity before the arrest. He was living with his daughter and 15-year-old granddaughter at the time of his arrest, and was acting perfectly healthy and very fit for his age. When presenting to court, he was in a wheelchair and pretending to be senile. Such act. Before breaking in and raping, he would stalk and call the phone lines several times. He would then call the victims after the rape and breathe heavily into the phone and/or whisper. There is audio of one of these calls. It's quite disturbing. He also went back to rape a victim. There are HBO series, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, about Joseph. He was a real piece of work. Before raping the wife, he'd tie up the husband and put some plates on his back, and tell him if he hears the plates crash then he will kill the guy's wife. So basically the husband has to lie there motionless while hearing his wife getting raped by that piece of shit. Edit. Another thing that happened was, there was a town meeting about the attacks where everyone tried to make sense of it. One guy declared that the husbands were cowards and if the rapist broke into his house then he would give him a piece of his mind. That guy's house was targeted next and the guy suffered the same fate. It's disgusting. He also raped a few women whilst their children were lying in bed next to her. I believe he tied up one of the little boys and placed him on the floor before proceeding to rape the mother. And because she was protecting her baby child, she would have to do as told. What a piece of shit. That doesn't even cover it. Just pure evil. What are some solved mysteries? Leave a comment and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos like this one.